Harold Jenkins pushed open the heavy glass doors of Crestmont Bank, feeling the chill of air conditioning wash over his worn jacket. The lobby stretched before him like a cathedral of polished marble, the floors gleaming so brightly that he could see his own reflection for a brief moment. He leaned slightly on his cane, the familiar weight both comforting and necessary, and took a slow step forward. In his hand was a small envelope, thick with the carefully saved earnings of a lifetime, savings he had painstakingly built from decades of working long hours, often in jobs that didn't always treat him fairly, yet had kept him proud and independent. Today, he had come to make a deposit, a simple transaction that should have been ordinary, even mundane, but he couldn't shake the tension tightening in his chest. As Harold approached the teller counters, he noticed the subtle shift in the air. A young woman with perfectly styled hair and a crisply pressed uniform glanced up and immediately looked away. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, pausing mid-typing, and she whispered something to a colleague behind the glass, smirking before quickly covering it with a cough. Harold's stomach sank. He had walked into many banks in his lifetime, but something about the way these employees looked at him felt different, like he didn't belong, like he had accidentally wandered into a space where he was invisible and unwelcome at the same time. Harold cleared his throat gently, letting the sound echo faintly against the high ceilings. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice calm but firm. He had been taught from childhood to maintain his composure, even when faced with adversity, and he clung to that lesson now. The tellers glanced at him, barely, and then returned to their screens. One young man muttered under his breath, loud enough for Harold to catch a syllable or two, "This is going to take forever." Harold's heart ached at the sting, a familiar reminder that prejudice could appear in the most ordinary places. He stepped forward to the first available teller, trying to ignore the tension in the air. "I'd like to make a deposit," he said, placing the envelope on the counter. The man behind the glass raised an eyebrow and gave a small, dismissive smile. Harold noticed the way he shifted slightly, crossing his arms as if to create an invisible barrier between them. "Sir," the teller said, his tone polite but condescending, "I think you need to step aside. We can't handle this right now." Harold frowned, leaning a bit heavier on his cane. "Excuse me," he asked, surprise threading through his voice. "I've been banking here for years," he continued, "and I just need to make a deposit." The teller glanced toward the branch manager, who had just appeared from an office tucked behind the counter. Harold could see the manager's face tighten, the faint flicker of irritation crossing her features as she studied him. "Sir," she said finally, her voice clipped, "you need to leave. We don't serve people like you here." The words struck Harold like a physical blow. His heart raced, and for a moment he froze, unable to believe what he had just heard. He had lived a long life, worked harder than most, and earned every penny of what he carried in that envelope, and yet, here he was, dismissed as if he were nothing. People in the lobby began to notice the tension, some shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, others pretending not to see. The whispers grew louder. Harold felt a hand on his shoulder, a kind gesture from a stranger who didn't know him but could sense the injustice, but he politely shook it off. He stood taller, despite the sting of humiliation. "I don't understand," he said, his voice firm but quivering slightly. "I have a right to conduct my business here. I've been a loyal customer for decades. How can you treat me this way?" The manager's eyes flickered with impatience. "Sir, I suggest you leave before things escalate. This is not up for debate." Harold's mind raced. He thought of his children, his grandchildren, the values he had tried to instill in them, the courage to stand up, the dignity to insist on respect. He refused to leave quietly. He straightened his shoulders, planted his cane firmly, and took a deep breath, preparing to demand to see someone higher up. "I want to speak to the branch manager," he said, though he already knew he was speaking to the person responsible. "And if necessary, the board of directors. I will not be treated this way." The young tellers whispered amongst themselves, glancing nervously at their manager, unsure how to handle the situation. Other patrons shifted uneasily in their seats, some staring outright, some trying not to. The air felt heavier with each passing second, thick with the tension of an injustice playing out so openly. Harold could feel a mixture of fear, anger, and indignation coiling inside him, but he also felt something else, an unyielding determination not to allow this moment to define him or his worth. With every tap of his cane against the marble floor, he reminded himself that dignity and self-respect were not negotiable, and that sometimes standing alone in the glare of discrimination could still spark the recognition of those who mattered. The manager exhaled sharply, clearly frustrated with Harold's refusal to back down. She waved a hand toward the door as if dismissing him entirely. Harold, however, would not move. He placed a hand over his heart and raised the envelope, letting it signify more than money. It represented decades of work, sacrifice, and integrity. The murmurs in the room grew louder, the bank's usual calm and sterile environment fractured by the weight of one man's quiet defiance. In that moment, Harold Jenkins was more than a customer. He was a reminder that dignity, even in the face of systemic prejudice, could not be erased. Harold Jenkins stood outside the polished glass doors of Crestmont Bank, the afternoon sun warming his face but doing nothing to ease the sting of humiliation. The manager's words still echoed in his ears, sharp and dismissive, "We don't serve people like you here." Each syllable was a reminder of the invisible walls society had placed in front of him, walls he had spent his life navigating with patience and dignity. But standing there, he felt the weight of decades of subtle slights and overt discrimination pressing down in one unbearable moment. People hurried past on the sidewalk, some glancing curiously, some pretending not to notice, and Harold drew in a steadying breath, letting the rhythm of his cane tapping against the pavement anchor him. He had expected discomfort, perhaps even cold indifference, but he had not expected the raw, unfiltered prejudice that the bank employees had shown. It was one thing to face unfairness in small, passing moments. It was another to be publicly dismissed, humiliated in a space where he had every right to be. Yet, even in that humiliation, Harold felt a spark of resolve. He would not allow this to be the last word. Not today, not ever. Unbeknownst to the staff inside, the bank's board of directors had arrived earlier than anticipated for an unannounced inspection. A small entourage moved quietly through the upper floors, observing operations and interactions with a practiced, critical eye. Cameras discreetly followed their every step, documenting both the staff's behavior and the service environment. As Harold tapped his cane, regaining composure, the board members quietly maneuvered toward the lobby, drawn by the unusual tension in the air. Inside, the tellers and staff remained oblivious to the presence of the directors. They whispered nervously to each other, uneasy with the confrontation but unaware that their every move and word was being scrutinized. Harold's demand to speak to the branch manager had thrown the lobby into a tense standoff. The young tellers' faces were pale, smiles forced, their casual arrogance evaporating under the unspoken weight of Harold's dignity. He stood firm, envelope in hand, a symbol of every sacrifice, every hard-earned dollar, every day spent building a life with integrity. When the board members reached the lobby, the scene unfolded before them like a carefully orchestrated drama, except it was raw and unfiltered. An elderly black man, tall and steady despite his years and the weight of a cane, had been effectively expelled from a bank that had profited from his loyalty for decades. His calm voice, firm yet tinged with the shock of affront, contrasted sharply with the murmurs and stifled giggles of the staff. Cameras caught the subtle expressions of the bank employees, the discomfort, the irritation, the defensive postures, as the board quietly observed from a distance. Harold shifted his weight and raised his voice slightly, not in anger, but in clarity. "I have been a loyal customer here for decades," he said, projecting each word with precision. "I come here with my savings, with trust, and I am met with contempt. I deserve respect, and I will not leave until it is afforded to me." The words reverberated in the high-ceilinged lobby, clear and unwavering. Some customers looked away, uncomfortable but attentive, others whispered in shock. And all the while, the board members exchanged glances, their expressions hardening as they processed the situation. The branch manager, flustered, waved a hand toward the door again, her patience fraying. "Sir, please, just leave. You are making this difficult," she insisted, her voice tight. Harold's eyes met hers, and in that moment, the disparity between authority and morality was laid bare. He stood not as a supplicant, but as a witness to the injustice perpetrated in the name of efficiency, appearances, and privilege. The board members, hidden behind the mirrored glass and subtle positioning of the cameras, leaned in slightly, noting the dissonance, capturing every hesitation, every defensive word. One director, a woman in her early 50s with sharp eyes, whispered to her colleague, "This is worse than I expected. Look at the way they dismiss him." Her colleague nodded, a frown etched deeply across his face. The scenario was a textbook example of institutional bias, the kind that training sessions and ethics seminars often glossed over. But here, it was visible in real time, undeniable and raw. Every gesture, every whisper, every subtle smirk of the staff was evidence of a culture that tolerated, even encouraged, such behavior. Harold, sensing that leaving without asserting his dignity would be a concession he could never forgive himself for, straightened further. He tapped his cane deliberately, the sound firm against the marble floor. His voice rang out once more, calm but resolute. I am not going anywhere until this is addressed. I am entitled to the respect and service that any customer deserves. I will not be ignored. The murmurs from the tellers grew louder, nervous now, as the board's presence, though hidden, added a pressure they could neither see nor acknowledge. Outside, Harold felt the warmth of the sun against his back, a stark contrast to the coldness inside. The moment had become larger than a simple bank transaction. It was about respect, accountability, and the enduring human demand for dignity. And though the board remained largely unseen by the staff, their gaze, and the silent recording devices following their every move, promised that the truth of this encounter would not remain hidden for long. Harold Jenkins, elderly, determined, and unbowed, was no longer just a customer. He had become the embodiment of accountability waiting to unfold. Harold Jenkins remained on the sidewalk, leaning slightly on his cane, the envelope of his savings clutched firmly in one hand. The sun had shifted lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement, but the heat of the afternoon had little effect on the fire of indignation burning quietly inside him. He had been expelled from Crestmont Bank, dismissed as if he were invisible, as if decades of loyalty and trust could simply be erased by prejudice. Yet, Harold did not feel defeated. Instead, he felt a quiet anticipation, an almost instinctive sense that the story had not ended and that the injustice he had faced might not go unnoticed. Inside the lobby, the tellers and branch manager were recovering from the confrontation, whispering nervously among themselves, unsure if Harold's defiance had consequences beyond the few awkward moments of embarrassment they had just endured. Their murmurs were interrupted by the subtle approach of the bank's board of directors. Cameras followed the directors carefully, recording every expression, every interaction. The board members moved with deliberate patience, observing the aftermath, noting the tension that had electrified the air, and recording the teller's discomfort, the manager's irritation, and the stark, undeniable contrast presented by Harold's composed but firm stance. A tall man in a tailored suit stepped closer to the glass doors, his expression neutral but calculating. Harold, sensing movement through the reflection in the glass, looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as he recognized the difference in the energy surrounding this group. The directors had arrived unseen by the staff earlier, and now, quietly, their presence began to shift the balance in the room. They watched, noting the silence of the customers, the unease of the employees, and the courage of the elderly man outside. One director muttered to another, barely above a whisper, "This is the kind of situation that exposes a culture, not just an incident." His colleague nodded, frowning as she observed the staff's thinly veiled panic. The manager, unaware of the oversight, glanced nervously at the doors, then back at the tellers. "Is he gone?" she asked, more to herself than anyone else. "Yes, ma'am," one teller replied, his voice trembling slightly. But the directors knew the truth. Harold was outside, steadfast, unbowed, and he represented something far larger than a single transaction. His presence was a mirror, reflecting not just the bank's failure to serve a customer, but the deeper, systemic prejudices that had allowed such behavior to be normalized. From outside, Harold heard the low hum of voices through the doors, the faint sound of movement. He shifted his weight on the cane, feeling the strain in his legs, but he refused to retreat. He adjusted the envelope under his arm, a symbol of every sacrifice he had made, every long day of work, every careful decision that had gone into securing his family's future. This was not merely money, it was a testament to his life's labor, and he would not allow it to be dismissed along with his humanity. Suddenly, the lobby doors opened. The branch manager stepped out, flustered, attempting to assert authority one last time. "Sir, you really need to leave," she said, her voice tight, but now tinged with unease. Harold met her gaze steadily. "I will not leave until someone in authority acknowledges the way I have been treated," he said, voice firm, unwavering. The director who had approached from inside now followed closely, his presence commanding but calm. He introduced himself with a measured tone. "Mr. Jenkins, I am Robert Calder, a member of the board of directors. I've observed the situation, and I want to understand exactly what happened." The words struck the manager like a blow. She faltered, realizing her dismissal of Harold had been witnessed and recorded, that the truth of her actions was now undeniable. Harold straightened, raising his chin slightly, feeling the balance of power shift in a way he had only hoped for. He recounted the incident, slowly, clearly, emphasizing every slight, every dismissive word, every gesture of prejudice. The board member listened intently, nodding occasionally, taking notes, recording the honesty and dignity with which Harold spoke. Other board members emerged from the lobby, their eyes serious, evaluating the staff, the environment, the entire chain of behavior that had led to this moment. Customers in the background watched in quiet astonishment as the bank, which had moments ago seemed untouchable, now faced scrutiny and accountability. The tellers looked down, shifting uneasily as they realized the enormity of what had been captured. Their attitudes, their actions, and their prejudices were now visible to those who could enforce change. Harold, feeling the subtle shift in the air, allowed himself a small, private smile. He had stood his ground, and now the wheels of justice, slow but inevitable, were beginning to turn. The directors asked the staff for immediate corrective actions, for formal apologies, and for transparency in reporting incidents of discrimination. Cameras captured the manager's reluctant compliance, their acknowledgement that the situation had crossed a line. As he stepped back onto the sidewalk, Harold felt a surge of quiet triumph. Though no one could erase the humiliation he had endured, accountability had arrived in a way that was undeniable. For decades, he had fought quietly against prejudice. Now, the system itself was forced to confront its failings. He clutched the envelope a little tighter, lifted his chin, and began walking toward the street, cane tapping in steady rhythm. This day had become larger than one bank, one transaction, or one man. It had become a moment of truth, a reminder that dignity, courage, and perseverance could not be ignored, even in the face of the most entrenched injustice.